Dear students, welcome back to the second video lecture on elements of mechanical engineering, module number 5 and part 2. In the previous lecture, we discussed about the major parts of a lathe. We discussed 6 major parts. The first part is the bed, second headstock, third tailstock, fourth carriage assembly, fifth feed rod, and sixth lead screw. Today in this lecture we are going to discuss the main functions of all these major parts in the lathe. So here the first part of the lathe, that is bed. The bed is the foundation of the lathe and supports all other parts. The headstock and tailstock are mounted on the inner guideways while the carriage assembly is mounted on the outer guideways of the bed. Now we go to the photo of the lathe and we can see where is the bed. So in the previous lecture, I explained about the lathe bed. We identify the lathe bed where it is. So this is the lathe bed, we can see, and this side we have another column. So this is the one column, this is the second column. These two columns we call as lathe bed. So we can see these are all the two supporting columns. These two supporting columns are supporting all the major parts of the lathe, the headstock and tailstock, tool post, carriage assembly, lead screw, feed rod. So all these parts of the lathe are supported by this lathe bed. So this is the main function of the lathe bed. Let us move to the next slide and see the next, what is the major part. Now the second part of the lathe, that is the headstock. It is located on the left side over the bed. It comprises of the main drive for different speeds. The main spindle called the live center projects out. It holds the workpiece and rotates the workpiece at various speeds. So headstock, that is mounted on the left hand side of the lathe. So I told this is the headstock. You can see this is the headstock. It is also called as live center because inside this headstock we have a electric motor. That electric motor, when you switch on the electric switch, it will rotate at high speed, and there is a spindle which is connected to the electric motor, so that spindle also rotates, and we can see the one end of the spindle is fixed with a chuck. This part is the chuck and it can hold the workpiece, and inside we have gear mechanism also. By using that gear mechanism we can increase and decrease the speed of the spindle rotation. So this is the main function of the headstock. So now we'll go to the next part of the lathe, that is tailstock. It is a movable part mounted on the right side of the lathe bed. It carries the dead center in it. The main functions are to support the free end of the workpiece, to hold tools like drill bit, reamers, taps, etc. This is the main function of the tailstock. So we will see the tailstock here. This is the tailstock of the lathe which is mounted on the right side of the lathe. We can see this is the right side. It can move to the left side also and it can move to the right side also. We can slide this. We can slide the tailstock. The main function of the tailstock is to support the one end of the workpiece. Okay, one end of the workpiece. Previous class I told we can mount the cylindrical workpiece in between the headstock and the tailstock. If you consider this is the cylindrical workpiece which is mounted on the lathe, so this end generally held by this chuck holding device, and the other end, okay, so this end will be supported by the tailstock. Okay, this is the one function of the tailstock. Next we can use some drilling tools, okay, and knurling tools, grinding tools, whatever. If you wanted to use some other tools, for example, which is not possible to hold in the tool post, okay, those tools we can hold in the tailstock and we can use it for different machining operations. That is the another main function of the tailstock in the lathe. Next, we'll go to the next part of the lathe. So fourth part, that is the carriage. It guides over the outer guideways of the lathe bed. This assembly holds the cutting tool and controls the cutting process. It consists of saddle, cross slide, compound rest, tool post and apron. So here this part is called as carriage assembly. So it is the assembly of different sub assemblies. Okay, sub assemblies means some small another parts of the lathe are included in the carriage assembly. We can see, okay, the first part, that is the saddle and cross slide, compound rest, and again we have tool post, apron. Okay, so these are all the sub parts or the sub assembly of the carriage assembly. The main function of the carriage assembly we can see in the photo here. This whole thing we call it as a carriage assembly. So here uh, this carriage assembly can move, okay, so left side and right side. Okay, we can give the movement to the carriage assembly. It can move to the left side and right side. Here we have a hand wheel. Okay, this hand wheel we can rotate clockwise and anti-clockwise so that this carriage assembly will slide. Okay, for that we require guide ways. We can see this is the guide way for the carriage assembly. So on this guide way, carriage assembly can move to the left side and right side when you rotate this hand wheel clockwise and anti-clockwise. And there is a cross slide also, sub parts, and tool post is also mounted on the carriage assembly. So the main function of the carriage assembly, okay, it can control the cutting process. Okay, I told we can cut the material or the raw material by using the lathe. That cutting process can be controlled by using this carriage assembly or the carriage. So next we'll move to the next part of the lathe. So next part of the lathe, that is the feed rod. Feed rod, it is a long rod in front of the lathe bed and gives longitudinal movement for the carriage for all its operations except thread cutting. Okay, so this is what the definition for feed rod. So we can see in the photo where is the feed rod. We can see this is the, there is a rod we can see here. So this rod which is passing from this end to this end, this is called the feed rod. This feed rod will allow the carriage assembly to move to the left side, again right side as you rotate this hand wheel. Okay, so we can move this to the right side, again to the left side by using the carriage, by using the lead screw or the, sorry, the feed rod. This is the feed rod. We can see another rod is there. Okay, don't confuse, this is the feed rod and this is called the screw rod. Okay, so this we'll discuss next. So next part is the screw rod. Okay, so what is the next part? That is the lead screw or the screw rod. It is a long screw with square threads on it mounted front of the lathe bed. It gives the automatic feed to the carriage during the thread cutting operation. Okay, it is used only during thread cutting operation. Okay, so that is the lead screw or the screw rod. Okay, so that we can see in the diagram. So this is the lead screw of the lathe. This lead screw is used only while doing thread cutting operation. Okay, we'll discuss the different operations performed on the lathe later. So here the screw rod or the lead screw is having screw, okay, or screw threads on it. Okay, we can see, we can observe the screw threads, square threads are there on the lead screw. And okay, during thread cutting operation we can move this carriage assembly automatically left side and right side so that we can do the thread cutting operation. So for that purpose we are going to use lead screw. So this lead screw we can engage with the carriage assembly so that carriage assembly will move to the left side and right side automatically during thread cutting operation. So for thread cutting operation purpose only we are using this lead screw. So these are all the main parts of the lathe what we have discussed, there are 6 main parts of the lathe, major parts: bed, headstock and tailstock, carriage assembly, feed rod and lead screw. These are all the major parts or the main parts of the lathe. Any lathe always should have all these parts. So next we'll move to the next slide. Okay, lathe specifications. Lathe specifications. For any machine, if you take, all the machines will be having some specifications. Okay, so how we can decide the size of the lathe, for example? Okay, so how do you choose the size of the lathe? For example, if you are buying a lathe, so we have to give some specification to the manufacturer. So this is the size of the lathe I want. Okay, this can machine this size of the workpiece or the raw material, this can. Okay, and what is the length of the bed, what is the height of the workpiece we can machine, what is the maximum diameter of the workpiece we can machine. So all these are called specification of the lathe. Okay, lathe is having some important specifications. First specification, that is overall length of the bed. We can observe here overall length of the bed. So I told this is the bed of the lathe, this part is the bed of the lathe. So what is the total length of the bed from this end to this end, that decides what is the size of the lathe. Okay, so next, distance between the centers. Okay, so here we have the live center or the headstock, and we can fix the workpiece here. Okay, so in between these two centers, and this is called the tailstock, and here it is having a center that is called the dead center. In between these two we can hold the cylindrical workpiece which is having some length. Okay, so what is the maximum length of the workpiece we can hold in between these two centers? Okay, that decides the what is the size of the lathe. And again, swing of workpiece over lathe bed, swing of workpiece over lathe bed. For example, okay, what is the maximum diameter? For example, if you come here, if you see this, what is the maximum diameter we can mount on the machine to do the machining process? That is, okay, so this diameter we can see here, we have the maximum gap, and here also we have the maximum gap. Okay, this is what the maximum diameter of the raw material or the workpiece we can mount on the lathe, and we can do the machining process. That is also another specification. So these are all the main specifications of the lathe which decides the size of the lathe and what is the maximum size of the workpiece the lathe is going to machine. So next we have some of the generally performed lathe operations on the lathe machine. Okay, here we have 5 different machining processes or the lathe operations we can perform on the lathe. First operation, that is called plane turning. It's also called as turning. Simply we can call this also as turning process. Next process, that is the facing. Next we have knurling process. Fourth one, that is thread cutting. Fifth one, taper turning. Okay, so this taper turning operation can be performed on the lathe by using two methods or two ways. One method, that is called swiveling the compound rest, and another one is offsetting the tailstock. Okay, so these are all the main operations performed or general operations of the machining processes performed on the lathe machine. So in detail about all these operations we will discuss in the next video lecture. Till all of you, thank you for your patience to listening to my lecture. Thank you all of you.